truth will be taught, I'm confident will be, and that as a result of that, all of us could be built up who are already saved, and any of us who are not in a right relation will become saved. That's our hope. Efforts like this seemingly are getting fewer. Some churches don't have meetings anymore, and I'm thankful that we do, and that we have good interest in it. And so we're looking forward to that. Come on in, we just started. So in what we've been doing, for those of you visiting, we've been going through the Bible, and we're following a schedule of private readings, and most of the visiting won't have that, but our private readings we publicly review are from Luke 19 to the end of Luke this morning. We pointed out in earlier lessons that Luke emphasizes what aspect of Jesus? His humanity. We have more human interest stories, we might say, more about Mary in the book of Luke than any other account. And we come down to Luke 19, and we are really down to about the end. We have the triumphal entry in Luke 19, the parable of the husbandman. In fact, in 20, we have this recorded in Matthew and Mark also. Jesus is accosted by some people, and he's asked after he cleanses the temple, by what authority do you do these things? Who gave you this authority? And Jesus answered that by saying, the baptism of John. Where did it come from? From heaven or men? And they knew if they answered it either way, he had them. And so what did they do? Or not do? They didn't answer. And so he gave the parable that follows. In chapter 21, what's the major discussion here? The what? Destruction of Jerusalem. That's right. And then in chapter 22, we're all the way down to, in fact, verse 1 tells us what? The Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is called the Passover. Just a quick reminder. Which came first, the Passover or the Feast of Unleavened Bread? The Passover was on the first month of the Jewish calendar, religious calendar, the 14th day at evening. And the Feast of Unleavened Bread was on the 15th day through the 21st day. So, 22nd day. So from the 14th day to, I had to write, the 21st day. So you have really the first day as Passover, and then you had 7 days of unleavened bread. But could you have any unleavened bread on the Passover either? No. And so really you have an 8-day period where there's no leaven, but it's sometimes they're joined, kind of like we do Christmas holidays. Christmas holidays, we sometimes include the first of the year. And so such it was with the Jews during that time. But Luke 22:1 mentions that. And the chief priests and scribes sought how they might put him to death, for they feared the people. So we don't want to make too much of a tumult. And so what happened was, they wanted to do it not around the Passover, but on God's timetable. Christ was to be sacrificed when? On the Passover. And so things began to develop quickly, and then they had a willing accomplice in who? Judas. In Judas. And so Judas conspires. They want to know where they might take him subtly, and so Judas conspires with them about that. Knew that he would go to the guard. So we have some events on Thursday. The final Passover is somewhat detailed in Luke 22:14 and following. And then toward the end of the Passover, Jesus institutes what? The Lord's Supper. And then we have some words with Peter that we don't have quoted in other places. Simon, verse 31, Simon, Simon, behold, Satan asked to have you that he might sift you as wheat. But I made supplication for thee that thy faith fail not. And do thou, when once thou hast turned again, establish thy brethren. I think if I'd been Peter, I'd probably say that again. So what? Satan has been talking about me, and that begs the question, if we think, could Satan be talking about you to the Lord? And did he talk to the Lord about Job?
Yes.
Yes. He had a pretty good conversation that we have recorded in Job 1 and 2. And so there's that conversation going on, and that gives us reason to pause. The betrayal is of course during this time. And then in chapter 23, we have Jesus during the what? 6 of them. The trials, that's right. During the trials are recorded, not all of them in Luke. And then where we've just been in our study, we have Jesus taken out to be crucified, his crucifixion, and we have an event that's recorded here in Luke 23, not recorded in Matthew, Mark, or John, and that's his conversation in the tomb on the cross. The thief, that's right. And so did both of them castigate Jesus at the first? Yes. But after a while, he changes his mind and says, we're getting what we deserve. But he's done nothing amiss. Why are you going ahead and doing what you did to the other thief? And so then he turns to the Lord and says, Lord, remember me when thou comest in thy kingdom. And the Lord tells him, today, what? Shalt thou be with me in paradise. Luke also records, as Matthew and Mark, the darkness over the land, we'll get to that in just a little bit, 44. That's around what time? Well, first of all, Jesus is crucified about what time? About 9 in the morning. And then there are roughly those 3 sayings, or 3 words, 3 phrases that he used. Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. That evidently was the first one. And then there's a question over the second and third. If it, woman, behold thy son, behold thy mother. And also the other one was what during that time? What's that?
When he talked to the thief?
Yeah. Yes. Yes. So Father, forgive them. Woman, behold thy son, behold thy mother, and then today shalt thou be with me in paradise. And so we have those 3, the first 3 hours. Then what happened from around noon, the 6th hour to the 9th hour? There's darkness. And then we have the last 4 sayings of Jesus on the cross. And then Jesus dies. Into thy hands I commit my spirit. And then there are all these events that we'll talk about in just a moment. All these events that occurred at the time he died. And we'll go into that in a minute. Then in chapter 24, what do we have? His resurrection and some of the appearances. And then in Luke 24, I just want to call your attention to this. In the very end, in verses 46 and 7, we have the commission according to Luke's account. And he's ready to ascend into heaven. In fact, in 50, 51, 2, and 3, you'll see there he led them out, that is the apostles, until they were over against Bethany, and lifted up his hands and blessed them, and came to pass when he parted and was carried up into heaven. That is almost like a run-in to what chapter and of what book? Acts 1. Yes, Acts 1. You can take Acts 1 and these last verses of Luke 24 and put it together. And it just so happened that Acts was written by Luke. And so he actually takes back off where takes over where he leaves off in Luke 24 with the apostles having been commissioned to preach his gospel. And then they returned with great joy. Look at verse 52. He was carried into heaven. They worshiped him and returned to Jerusalem with great joy and were continually in the temple blessing God. That's a type of a summary statement. But they go back with great joy. And how many days is it from the time that he ascends from their midst until Pentecost? from the time he ascends until the Pentecost.
About 9 days.
Okay?
40.
There's 40 that he appeared to them, and then he's raised. Pentecost was on was 50 days after the Sabbath of Passover, so 7 weeks from that Sunday, and of the resurrection. So we have about a 10-day period from the time he was raised until the day of Pentecost. And so during that time, they have joy, and then according to Acts 1, they appoint who? Matthias to be numbered with the 11, and to talk a little bit about Judas. Okay. All right, let's comment, question. All right, let's move back to where we are. We're on page 120 of our notes. Those of you who are new to us, we're in the midst of the crucifixion, and we've been talking. Well, let me just go ahead and do this. Get my clicker. Where's the clicker? There it is. Okay, so we've been talking about where we are. This is just an overview of the last week, 10 days, and I will come back to this. Often the Bible covers many years and a few chapters. We see that in the early chapters of Genesis. Here, a few days, the last 10 days are covered in many chapters. In fact, just the last several hours we've gotten a lot of information in the last few hours. And then we've been talking about Friday, the day of suffering. We finished the trial of Jesus. Jesus was scourged. Pilate reluctantly released him. And then we have these events here. On the way to the cross, the soldiers take off his purple robe. They lead him out. Simon of Cyrene is compelled to carry the cross. They arrive at Golgotha, give him wine mingled with gall and myrrh, and he does not drink it, a type of, like taking some Tylenol to deaden the pain. And we looked at the fact that this is likely, it's called Gordon's Calvary because a fellow in the 1800s from England, Gordon, an English explorer, believed that corresponded to the place where Jesus had been crucified. It answers several things. There's some that believe that he was crucified in a different place, and yet that was inside the wall of the first century city. And it plainly states that they took him out of the city. And in Hebrews 13, it mentions that he was taken outside the camp. And so this would correspond likely. And then, Father, the first of 7 phrases, Father, forgive them, they know not what they do. His first 3 statements were basically to other or for others, and then the last 4 relative to himself and his relation to God. We talked about the significance of that statement. I want to just really emphasize one more thing here, if I can find it. Yes, right here. I want to emphasize this. That Jesus' statement, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do, is actually an internal evidence of Jesus' deity. Because all of us have sinned. Jesus didn't. And it is just completely opposite of what any man who was a common criminal would say at the very end of his life. None of that would have come from a common criminal. And I remember Josh and I publicly talking about that usually people who are on death row and they're facing their execution, they're either remorseful, they're sorry that they did what they did, they express regret, hope the family that the member they killed will forgive them, or they're a rebel to the end. There's just really not any middle ground. And Jesus never expressed regret because he was giving himself how? Willingly. No regret about it. And there was no sin in his life to be remorseful over. So his words on the cross are internal evidences of his deity as well as the inspiration of Scripture. And we mentioned this, a divine restraint in its recording is a mark of its inspiration. No way uninspired men could have fabricated such a story. We made the point Wednesday night that one of the big things is that divine restraint on the recording is seen in, as the accounts read, they took him out and there they crucified him. And that's the end. And then they keep going with something else. They don't editorialize as we would about all the indecencies and the humiliation that he underwent, even there with his clothes around the cross. The malefactors on both sides mock him. Soldiers divide his garments. The superscription is written in the three languages one of the Jews, of government, of commerce. Everybody could read who this was. And then one of the malefactors repents, which we talked about Wednesday night. Verily I say unto you, today shalt thou be with me in paradise. We talked about how this is used so often by people who believe we can be saved without being baptized, and they use the thief as the example. The main point is, while Jesus, he could have been baptized, you could argue it either way under John's baptism, but he had the power to forgive. So the main point is he never heard the Great Commission. And we put this chart together. Here's where Jesus lived. He died under the binding force of the Old Testament. He could forgive on whatever conditions he chose during his life. And this is the time the thief lived. And then Jesus died, was buried, was raised. And during that 40-day appearance that Acts the first chapter mentions, that's when he gave the Great Commission. He was in Galilee in Matthew, back in Jerusalem in Mark and Luke. And so we have about 12 appearances. And we have about 3 of them, maybe 4 if you count John's, given during that 40-day appearance. He was dead. He was moldering in the dust of the dead when Jesus gave the words of the Great Commission. And then, of course, when Jesus ascended into heaven and then sent the Holy Spirit on the apostles on Pentecost and afterward, that's when the conditions of all the promises, the conditions, the facts to be believed, all of those things, a part of the new covenant, were made known on Pentecost and afterwards. So it's a spacious argument. It's just false to the core. For when people who just parroting what they've heard denominational teachers say, well, the thief was saved, he wasn't ever baptized. No, and he never heard the Great Commission. He never heard the New Covenant. He never lived under the time that we live. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, I wanted to go into some detail to just really cement these facts in all of our minds, that when people, because you hear it all the time, hear it in debates, and if somehow other. Another thing is people look at the thief as deathbed repentance. Of course, he wasn't on his deathbed, he was on the cross, but nonetheless, the thing to remember is whatever he knew about Jesus, whatever he was able to ascertain through the jeering of the crowd and perhaps other comments Jesus made that are not recorded, what the women, remember there was a multitude that Luke records that went away beating their breasts after the events. What all, even the centurion declared, surely this was the Son of God. And another account says, surely this was a righteous man. He's hearing all of that. And so when the thief says, look, he's done nothing amiss. We deserve to be here. And evidently he'd heard him talk. Maybe he heard Jesus and just didn't pay attention to it. Talk about the kingdom. Whatever it was, he said, Lord, when thou comest in thy kingdom, remember me. And so Jesus said, today shalt thou be with me in paradise. So it's not a case of, well, I'll wait to the end of life and then turn it over to the Lord. He was able to come to Jesus as soon as opportunity afforded him, seemingly. Just the opposite. And we looked at paradise and how that is seen in Hades, where the righteous are, and so on. Okay. Any comment or question? Of kind of review, actually. but there's so much. It really is the pinnacle of the Bible story. All right, let's if no questions or comments, let's look to John 19. And on page 120, we're still talking, as you see in the notes. We'll turn to John 19. I've got on the subheading on page 117. Jesus is crucified and reviled. His 3 sayings during the first 3 hours. And without reading all that, it's not necessary. Let's just turn to John 19. And we probably will read just a few more verses than what we have. But John 19, 25, 6, and 7. David, if you would read that. John 19, 25, 6, and 7.
Now, there stood by the cross of Jesus his mother, and his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus therefore saw his mother and the disciples whom he loved standing by, he said to his mother, Woman, behold your son. Then he said to the disciple, Behold your mother. And from that hour the disciple took her to his own home.
All right, let's answer our questions here. S at the top of the page. These passages record 4 women and a man standing by the cross. State who were specifically mentioned, then who is implied but not mentioned. Okay, for who all are there? First of all, Jesus' wife, his mother, and then
His
mother's sister, and then Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene, and then the disciple whom Jesus loved, who would have been John. And evidently John is standing close. In fact, if I understand the grammar correctly, he's standing close to Mary, maybe next to her. And he's standing right there with her. And so what were Jesus' words recorded in these verses? T. Woman? Yes. Behold thy mother. For whom is Jesus then most concerned even while he's dying? His mother. His mother. Some have asked, why did he say woman rather than mother? It's similar to John the 2nd chapter, when he is at Cana in Galilee, and the mother asked, Mary asked, why don't you do something about this problem? We've run out of wine. And he said, Woman, what have I to do with thee? That's not an insult, but here, if you just think, okay, here's Mary, and then the relation to Jesus down here biologically. But when he uses the word, let me back up. He's biologically her descendant. But who actually caused her to conceive? Luke 1, the Holy Spirit. So here you've got the deity of Jesus and the humanity of Jesus. What it looks like to me Jesus does is he removes himself from his humanity, or at least causes those who hear to think of him not just as the son of Mary, but as deity. And so hence in John 2, when he uses woman and he's talking to his mother, it's not an insult, but it's for everybody to understand, I am not doing this as Mary's son alone, but I'm doing this as deity. Likewise, here in John 19, woman, behold thy son. He's removing himself from this portion of just her son to the point that this is deity in human form dying on the cross for atonement. The work is distinct from his relation to his mother. That's the best I can do on that. So it makes sense to everybody. Comment, question? I don't have any notes on that, but yes, sir.
I've never noticed this before, I don't know why, but all 3 of the women standing there were named Mary too, so.
Yeah.
There didn't seem to be too many other names for women.
Yeah, it was a common Jewish name. You have in verse, if I can find it here again. Okay. There was standing by the cross of Jesus, verse 21, his mother. All right, she's not named, but her name was Mary. And his mother's sister. Now that would have been evidently Salome. who was the mother of the wife of Zebedee, who were the parents of James and John, which means James and John were what relation humanly to Jesus? Cousins, first cousins. And so you've got Mary, Salome, mother, sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and in Matthew, Mark, that would be of James the Less and Joseph, and then Mary Magdalene, about whom, of course, we understood Jesus cast out demons. So you've got, really, these relationships help to put together some of the relations between the apostles also. So those would be those, and I've got a note on that anyway. V. Other passages list the women and from them we may learn other names by which they were called, as well as their relations to other disciples. State who the various passages identify as being in some proximity to the cross. In Matthew, we have Mary Magdalene, and then Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, and likely Cleopas' husband, and then the mother of the sons of Zebedee, who were, I just mentioned, James and John. All right. Then in Mark's account, Mary Magdalene is mentioned. Then who? Mary, the mother of James the Less, and Joseph, and then Salome. So Salome would correspond to the mother of the sons of Zebedee. Well, Zebedee's James and John. We know that from Matthew 4, Luke 5, and the other accounts. So, and the note below, from this we should be able to determine that the women stood afar off at first. Matthew and Mark's account show likely were drawn closer later when they were convinced the soldiers would not harm them. That's in John's account. Summarized, these were the women present, their relative relations. Mary, the mother of Jesus, the wife of Joseph. The very fact that Jesus commended the care of his mother to John indicates something, or at least it implies something about Joseph. What might that be? He was dead. We don't really read much about Joseph after Luke 2. And so it could very well, some have assumed that Mary was probably young and Joseph was several years older. And all assumption, of course, but that Joseph died at some point. After all, Jesus was known in Matthew 13 simply as the carpenter's son. The carpenter's son. And so then you have Salome, Mary's sister, also the mother of James and John, author of the fourth gospel, as well as the epistles, and wife to Zebedee. Mary, the wife of Clopas and mother of James the Less and Joseph, and Mary Magdalene, out of whom Jesus had cast 7 demons. It's interesting to note that the first 3 statements Jesus made on the cross refer to others, and the last 4 refer to himself and to the Father. Yes, sir. Brother Farron?
That about Joseph sort of correlates with another place where Jesus was teaching, and they come to him and said, "Your mother and brethren are outside."
Outside, yes.
Didn't mention Joseph. His father would have been there too.
Exactly. Yeah, your mother and your brethren are outside. And he said, who are my mother and my brethren? But those who do the will of God. Yes. Great point. I was talking yesterday to our friend over in Italy. And they're just beginning the life of Jesus, and we're wanting to go back to in the birth and what Roman Catholicism teaches about what we're talking about relative to Mary. Mary, Jesus is considered her first what? Firstborn, which implies what? That she had others. And then in Matthew 1:25, Joseph knew her not till, T-I-L-L, till she brought forth her firstborn sons. So they had no sexual relations until, and the word till or until indicates that there's what that happens. There's a change that happens. And then in Mark 6 and Matthew 13 and other places where Jesus' sisters, or at least his brethren, are identified, indicate that she had children who, then you think, well, what kind of relation would Mary's other children be to Jesus? Biologically, we would call them what? Half-brothers, half-sisters, yes. James, not James the brother of John, but James who wrote the book of James, and was a very influential character in the Jerusalem church, as per Acts 15, would have no doubt been not the apostle, because he's killed in Acts 12, but it would have been James, the brother to Jesus. And Jude would have been a brother, a half-brother to Jesus. So we get some of these connections in the New Testament with all that.
Philip,
Yes, sir.
another time his brothers came to him and said, you need to go to Jerusalem and show your face in Jerusalem.
Yes. In fact, I'm glad you brought that up. Some make a point, that's in John 7, I think it's verse 5. Turn over real quickly to that. John 7, verse 5. It was in that paragraph. Jesus is delaying, the Feast of Tabernacle was at hand, verse 3. And verse 3 is what you were talking about, Farron. His brethren said, depart and go to Judea, that your disciples also may behold your works which you do. Likely, in sarcasm. Why don't you go up and let everybody else see who you really are? And then he said, John records in verse 5, even his brethren did not believe on him. It's interesting, we made this point earlier. Even his brethren, his physical brethren, were kind of hard to come by the fact that he's the Messiah. But look over in Acts 1. The resurrection was a pivotal event that turned a lot of the thoughts that had been kind of teetering over whether he's the Messiah or not. It turned them completely around. Notice in Acts 1, verse 14. Look at the 120 who are described that are there in Jerusalem waiting with the apostles. These, that's the apostles, mentioned in 13, all with one accord continued steadfastly in prayer with the women, likely the ones who are around the cross, maybe some others, Mary, the mother of Jesus, and, oh, isn't that wonderful to read that? That these brethren who had been earlier somewhat skeptical by the events surrounding what we're reading right now, the death and then subsequent burial and then the resurrection and his appearances, all of those things were proof positive even to his physical half-brothers that he was the Messiah. But it could have been that the very fact that that at this point on the cross, let's go back real quick, got to where we were, when he says, behold thy mother, behold thy son. It could very well be that he felt closer to John, who was a cousin, than he did to some of his own brothers. Do any of us relate to that? That you can feel sometimes closer to somebody who's not in your family than you do in the family. And it could very well be that he had more confidence in John as being a good caretaker for his mother than maybe his own. Is that anything out of the ordinary? It really isn't. So anyway, those are all thoughts. Brother Henneke, I haven't mentioned you, but feel free to chime in on anything. Everybody knows that. All right. Now, here we go with the darkness for 3 hours, around noon to 3 p.m., and then death follows 4 more sayings. And then there are strange events that happen around the Lord's death. Let's read these passages. Let's read them in the order that we have them here. Matthew 27, 45 through 56. Brother Henneke, if you would read that for us. Matthew 27, 45 through 56.
Now from the 6th hour darkness fell upon all the land until the 9th hour. About the 9th hour Jesus cried out with a loud voice, saying, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. That is, my God, why have you forsaken me? And some of those who were standing there, when they heard it, began saying, this man is calling for Elijah. Immediately one of them ran, and taking a sponge, he filled it with sour wine and put it on a reed and gave him a drink. But the rest of them said, let us see whether Elijah will come to save him. And Jesus cried out again with a loud voice and yielded up his spirit. And behold, the veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and the earth shook and the rocks were split. The tombs were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. And coming out of the tombs after his resurrection, they entered the holy city and appeared to many. Now the centurion and those who were with him, keeping guard over Jesus, when they saw the earthquake and the things that were happening, became very frightened and said, "Truly this was the Son of God." Many women were there looking on from a distance, who had followed Jesus from Galilee while ministering to him. Among them was Mary Magdalene, and Mary the mother of James and Joseph, and the mother of the sons of Zebedee.
All right, thank you, Brother Carl. And we have the women listed there again. All right, let's go to Mark's account. Mark 15:33 through 41. James, would you read for us, please? Mark 15:33 through 41.
Now when the 6th hour had come, there was a darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. And at the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, saying, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani," which is translated, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Some of those who stood by, when they heard that, said, "Look, he is calling for Elijah." Then someone ran and filled a sponge full of sour wine, put it on a reed, and offered it to him to drink, saying, "Let him alone. Let's see if Elijah will come and take him down." And Jesus cried out with a loud voice and breathed his last. Then the veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. So when the centurion who stood opposite him saw that, he cried out like this and breathed his last. He said, "Truly, this man was the Son of God." There were also women looking on from afar. Among those were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of Jesus the Less and of Joseph, and Salome, who also followed him and ministered to him when he was in Galilee, and many other women who came up with him to Jerusalem.
Yeah, it's been mentioned several times before that women were the last at the cross and the first at the tomb. First at the tomb. And it's been my observation in most congregations, women outnumber men. I don't know what, maybe, I have some ideas maybe why that is, but that's just the case. These are mentioned in a commendatory way. They had followed him in his Galilean ministry. They had served him. What can we do for him? Perhaps fed him. We do know that he came to Martha's house, and Mary was sitting there listening. Lazarus was there, Luke 10. So numerous occasions we see just a little hint of what some of these women had done. All right, Luke 23, 44 through 49. Brother Richard, if you would. Luke 23, 44 through 49.
And it was about the 6th hour, and there was a darkness over all the earth until the 9th hour. And the sun was darkened, and the veil of the temple was rent in mist. And when Jesus had cried with a loud voice, he said, "Father, unto thy hands I commend my spirit." And having said thus, he gave up the ghost. Now when the centurion saw what was done, he glorified God, saying, "Certainly this was a righteous man." And all the people that came together to that sight, beholding the things which were done, smote their breasts and returned. And all his acquaintance and the women that followed him from Galilee stood afar off, beholding these things.
All right, we'll just make a quick comment. In verse 48, all the multitudes that came together to the sight, we don't have that in other accounts, when they beheld the things were done, returned, smiting their breast. The multitudes. What among the Jews, the ones who were primarily responsible for Jesus' crucifixion were what in their establishment? The rulers. At the very beginning, when Jesus came in, the triumphal entry, they were saying, what? Hosanna to the Son of David. Save, Lord, we pray. And then the chief priests and rulers were ridiculing the people for doing that. And Jesus said, you know, out of the mouth of babes and sucklings thou hast perfected praise. So the rulers, but then by the time the trials began, and it almost like it took the multitudes in kind of a wash, so to speak. And now they're experiencing all these miraculous phenomena. Then we have Jesus' words on the cross, and the darkness, and what in the world have we been led off to do? Kind of reminds you how some people think about after elections. Why did I vote for that person? You know, and what have I done? And they beat their breasts. That's an indication of what when somebody does that? Mourning, sorrow. Why did I do this? We have another phrase. I've used this a number of times. I could kick myself for doing it. Have y'all ever used that? Aggravating that you let yourself get away with something, and you do that. Well, that's how they felt. They had been led away, and so the events then there at the cross have convinced this centurion, whose responsibility it was to make sure that the execution was carried out. He's convinced. He would have been what, a Jew or a Roman? He'd been a Roman. And then the multitudes who've been led astray, they come back. And so often you got several things going on. One other passage, John 19, 28 through 30. John 19, 28 through 30. We're going to run out of time, I'm afraid. But John 19, 28 through 30. I'll read it myself here. After this, Jesus, knowing that all things are now finished, that the scripture might be accomplished, saith, I thirst. There was set there a vessel full of vinegar, so they put a sponge full of the vinegar upon the hyssop and brought it to his mouth. When Jesus therefore had received the vinegar, he said, it is finished. He bowed his head and gave up his spirit. Luke's record says that he also said, into thy hands I commend my spirit. Right. All right, let's see how we can answer. We got about 3 minutes. According to Matthew 27, Mark 15, and Luke 23, 44, what happened from the 6th hour to the 9th? What was over all the earth? Darkness. There's a question that comes often among good students, and that is, does all the earth, or over the whole land, mean the whole earth, or just the land of Judea, maybe the land of Israel? I don't know if there's a way of telling. The word, if you go to the word for the land or over all the earth, it's from a Greek word, gamma, and an ada. And we get the word Georgia, earthworkers. And so the word land, the word earth, one time the word world is used to be English words that would be translated from that Greek word. I went back and Thayer lists 5 ways it's used as arable land, the ground or the earth, the main land in contrast to sea and water, the earth as a whole or the world, and then a country or land included in the country within fixed boundaries. The only way you know is really context. And context does oftentimes help to explain but it's one little word, and it can be used it's like the word world. The word world comes from two different words. Cosmos, and that's like, the galaxies, all this. And then aeon, for an age. Like we say the word eon, which is really that's what it is. For eons, in Matthew 28, baptizing them in the name of the Father, and lo, I'm with you always, even to the end of the age, or the world, some translations have. Some make the argument that it could have been over the whole planet because of the universality of sin, and this is a day of darkness. This is in contrast to the light. And some say that, and some say maybe the land of Judea. I don't know. I really don't know. Any of you have any other ideas on it? Yes, sir.
It sounds like the flood was over the whole world, and in the beginning, darkness was over the whole place. So this likely was the whole world.
That's an idea.
Sounds like God put his hand over the sun.
Yes.
Because the sun was put there to give us light.
Give us light.
Day. And
Yeah.
that was such a dark time that he emphasized it.
Yeah, I was rereading Hendrickson this morning early, and Hendrickson was talking about, there was an argument made about what you were saying, really, Farron. The universal nature of sin was such that it could have been over the whole world. It was a miracle. Sometimes people have tried to argue, well, it could have been an eclipse. It could not have been an eclipse because the Passover was regulated by the lunar month. And there was no way that during that time that an eclipse could occur when there's a full moon. So that's out of the question. It wasn't a natural phenomenon. It was a miracle that happened, that occurred at this time. Yes, sir.
Would the Greek word for however that was transliterated have any bearing on whether or not that just meant?
No, and that's what I was saying. It's translated earth, land, world. It's translated in different ways where it really, you can't tell from the grammar what. You have to determine by context, and even the context here leads it. All we know is where all this happened, it was what? It was dark. Kind of reminds us of which plague? Darkness. Darkness, which preceded death of the firstborn. Is that not spine-tingling? Just think about that. Out of all the plagues, you have darkness, and then death of the firstborn. And here we have darkness, death of the firstborn. And people think that some Christians just kind of went together and threw all this together in the 2nd, 3rd centuries. Nothing could be farther from the truth. They've not examined it to see the internal evidences that shout out Jesus is, God is, the Bible is, this record is his inspired word.
The
And then Luke
totality of darkness and the length of time rules out an eclipse.
Yes, an eclipse doesn't last 3 hours.
Yes, and
Yeah.
it's usually in a certain area and not.
Not the whole, yes, that's a good point. Yeah, an eclipse goes in regions as the earth rotates.
So
Yes,
whatever covered it had to be big enough to cover the sun for 3 hours.
exactly. Great point. Yes, sir.
Luke's account said the sun's light was obscured, and that word means something passed over the light of the sun, blotting it out.
Yes.
So, God is able to do whatever he wants to do. And, knowing what we know about the shape of the earth and the stars, it was dark over a great part of the earth already. It was night.
Exactly. Exactly right. Yes. Yeah.
We know that he parted the sun for a period of time during the battle for Joshua.
For Joshua. Exactly. Okay, we're going to have to thank you for all your help. I hope our time together has been profitable, as always is for me. Farron brought out some great points, but Gene, others. And I tell you what, a study like this, it's to me, all the Bible in one sense is, but when you put things together and take our time and examine what all is going on, it is absolutely faith building. You have confidence. This really happened. It's not make-believe. This happened. And if this happened, I'm a sinner and I need what God and Christ did for me. Okay, we'll have to stop.